Hello students, it's Mrs. Moore's History. Today for 8th grade history. Again, the subject is the American Revolution. This is the second day. And again, we're aiming for a 30-minute lesson. It's Unit 5. And let's see. Again, we have this overarching question we're meant to be pondering. How does one colony breaking free from an empire affect all of modern history? And I want you to think more specifically for today, how did George Washington himself create an American army? Okay, we're going to talk about the idea of these colonists being very specifically attached to their own militias. And we mentioned last lesson because they wanted to stay close to home so they could look after their families, their farms, things like that. But how was George Washington's character such that he could make an American army, the Continental Army, which hadn't existed before? And you'll recall last time we went through the very end of Lexington and Concord and its significance all the way up through the Battle of Bunker Hill. All right, so let's go ahead and begin today. It's going to be much like last time with all my notes and my showing you maps sometimes and reading to you some stories I have from a couple of books that are relevant and good as well. Okay, so let's begin. It's good to see you. All right, let's see. So when Washington arrived in Boston, it was 9 weeks after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he found 16,000 colonial troops camped in huts and tents around the city. And so due to colonial prejudices, he had a problem. The colonists didn't want to work together. And this always makes me think of the Tower of Babel, how the men were working together to build this tower up to God, and then God knocked the tower down, and then the men couldn't understand each other, and therefore they didn't want to work together anymore after their languages had been scrambled so that they were different from one another. This makes me think of that. These men had their regional attachments to their own colony. They didn't want to work together. They saw themselves as someone from Massachusetts rather than an American. And so this war is going to change that. An American identity is going to emerge as the result of this war. All right. So let's think about George Washington for a moment. I mentioned last time I have a few pictures, a couple things to show you, so I will. This is from a book, The Fight for Freedom. Just has some interesting first-hand accounts and pictures of paintings and things of that nature. So what I'm going to show you first is an artist's rendering of Washington and his wife, Martha Custis, on their wedding day. So here we go. Let's see if that's a good view. You can see them. And we're so very used to seeing Washington with white hair and looking pretty old, frankly. So here he is as a young man getting married. And we know his wife, or maybe you don't know, his wife had been married before, and her husband had died, and she had 2 young children that then Washington became the father to them. All right. And so let me talk to you for a moment about Washington being given the command of the Continental Army. So chosen to lead. In 1775, the Second Continental Congress met. There had been a battle at Lexington and Concord, this we know, in Massachusetts between British soldiers and colonists who lived there. The British had tried to steal guns and powder. That the people had been saving up in case of war. The colonists had driven the British back to their post in Boston, but it seemed that more battles would soon take place. The Americans had the British locked inside Boston, where the new army wanted to drive them completely out of the city. The army needed a leader, and Washington was the only man for the job. He was still humble. He said, "I am not worthy of this honor." But the Congress voted on the question, and Washington got every single vote. He took command of the army. He wrote a letter to his wife to tell her of his new job. He also told her that he did not feel he was a good enough soldier for the task. And we remember in studying George Washington as a young man, again, remember that he's about the same age as George III. They had both been young men in their early 20s when the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War broke out. And Washington was extremely, well, he knew the land because he had been a topographer and or a surveyor, excuse me, and because he had worked with his brother's in-laws family. But he knew the land, and that's why he was a good choice to deliver the message to the French at Fort Duquesne. And we know what happened at Fort Necessity. We know with the fighting that he escaped basically unscathed. And so perhaps he thought that this was just luck. And so we're going to see how he's going to really learn to command men. All right. But he had been called by his country to lead the army, excuse me, and he had to be loyal to the call. And so he mounted his horse and headed for Boston. Along the way, Washington, the war hero and commander of the army, was cheered by excited crowds. Everyone turned out to see him when they heard he was coming along the road. The students at Yale gave him a real college welcome. They met him with a band and parade. On July 3rd, 1775, Washington sat on his horse under the famous Harvard elm on Cambridge Common. He drew his sword and took command of the Continental Army. The task before him was huge. He had thousands of men to train. He had to find rifles and cannons for the army. But with all this upon him, he managed to keep the British in Boston. He looked forward to the day when he could drive them out of the city. It took months. And so this is going to it's going to get into some things we're going to talk about. So I'm going to skip some of this, but I want to show you this painting that it's called Prayer at Valley Forge. You know what? I'm going to wait and show you that when we talk about Valley Forge. So just hold on one moment here. We'll put that aside. Get back to the lecture notes. Okay. So again, the army the militias are divided by where they're from. So the question is, how could Washington fix this? He had the loyalty of the troops. Ultimately, they chose him over those regional prejudices. They eventually learned to take orders and work together. You know, think kind of that great movie, Remember the Titans, that football movie. People were loyal to the school they had gone to. They were loyal based on race. And it's when they eventually realized their coaches were fair. They were loyal to their coaches. They became loyal to each other. And they were able to operate as a cohesive unit. So think in those terms, perhaps. All right. So what ultimately led the British to retreat from Boston? And we're going to talk more about how Washington shapes up the army. So in January of 1776, there was a good omen. The Green Mountain cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, remember that they arrived in Boston. The soldiers, again, they dragged them across the Appalachian Mountains. Washington had them placed overlooking the harbor, so Boston Harbor. How did the British react to this? General Howe saw the cannons pointed at Boston Harbor and knew Boston could not be held. In March 1776, Britain retreated to Halifax, Canada, so they retreated north. And 1,000 American loyalists went with them. So I think we can get back to this story again really quickly. All right. So, yep, all right. So this is one night in 1776. Washington secretly had sent some of his best troops to build earthen fortifications on a hill called Dorchester Heights. From the hilltop, the Americans could fire their cannons right down into the city of Boston. The next morning, British General Howe was stunned to see a fort on top of the hill. He said this army could not have done as much work in 6 months as the Americans had done in one night. He knew he didn't have a chance with the black cannon muzzles pointed down into the town. He put his men on ships and sailed away, and Boston was therefore free. Okay, so this is, again, now the British are out of Boston. Okay, so now remember who is, in fact, the ultimate leader of the British, and that is King George III. How do you think King George III feels upon hearing that the British have retreated from Boston? He was not happy with that. he ordered a blockade of all colonial ports. So, I think you understand what this means. Imagine the very strong British Navy setting up in the Atlantic, well, not down in Florida, but up here, a blockade. And so a blockade, as we know, is basically the enemy is going to keep supplies and men from getting to you. All right. And so that's what King George wants to do. It's a very common war tactic. If we're not going to be able to match them in war, we'll see that they can lose weapons and not have supplies, food. Will hurt their civilian population in that way as well. So that is a common tactic. Okay. Something else George III did was he used mercenaries. So these are troops for hire from Germany to fight the colonists. So if you've ever heard someone being called mercenary, it is an insult, and it means that you're only doing something for money. Think about in the Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, and we've talked about this in class before, the Thneed, which everyone needs. It isn't that everyone needed a Thneed, right? It was simply that the Onceler wanted to make money. All right, I'm not saying that making money is bad or wrong, but look at that. Nobody knows what a Thneed really is. That's kind of the joke there. And so to call someone mercenary, it means these Germans aren't fighting because they so believe in the British cause or they are so opposed to the Americans being free. It's thug for hire kind of thing, okay? So they're mercenaries. And I'll tell you what, Germans are notoriously good fighters. In particular, recall, as we've mentioned in class, that this is before there really even is a Germany. This is before German unification, which is going to take place in the 1860s, so around the time of the American Civil War. And so you have principalities or kingdoms in Germany, and the most prominent is going to be the Prussians. And there is an aristocratic class living in Prussia called the Junkers, spelled with a J, looks like Junkers, and they are very militaristic, and they are known for having very keen military understanding, for preparing, for always being ready for war. And in fact, when we think of World War I, the Kaiser Wilhelm II descended from these folks on his father's side. So, but we'll get some German help too on the American side. Fear not, fear not. So going on, all right. So eventually the mindset of the colonists is going to begin to change. So they went from saying we want the rights of the British citizens. We want to be represented in Parliament. We want a voice when we're being taxed. Remember, no taxation without representation. We don't want our harbor punitively shut down because you've taxed us unjustly. So it went from the Americans being irritated about wrongs, not wanting to quarter troops, etc., to eventually saying, we want our own country now. We are completely different from the British philosophically in our notion of how to govern ourselves and our notions of the rights of men. And so we do not want to be subject to a king any longer because we see that the king is really a tyrant in this case. So let's see how that mindset changes. And we're going to have your boy Thomas Paine coming again and playing a very profound role in all of this. Okay, so the colonist mindset collectively changed over time. Soon they weren't just fighting for their rights from the English crown, they were fighting to be an independent nation due to, in part, a large part, Thomas Paine's common sense. Now, we read parts of this together, as you will recall, and many of you found the language to be difficult, and I completely understand that. Hopefully you'll have a chance to encounter this primary source again in college. Maybe you'll be a political science major as I was, and you'll get the delight of reading those books again when you're 18 or 19 and perhaps your mind has matured and your vocabulary has developed, but it's a very important book. And again, it's kind of a a slight moment of shame, perhaps, to realize that the common man today in America would struggle to read this, whereas farmers, people of all walks of life could read it in those times. So again, read more. Yeah, you can do it. Okay. Who was Thomas Paine? He was a British writer who had moved to Philadelphia in 1774. Do you remember my telling you that he had basically left a pretty bad situation and he was bankrupt, and I think his marriage had failed, if I'm not mistaken. And so here's someone who's starting all over again. A good lesson in life, because sometimes we have to start all over again, don't we? So, but who knew that his most important days were before him, right? After the Battle of Lexington and Concord, he wrote Common Sense. Okay. And so let's consider how it affected both ordinary Americans and statesmen themselves. And if you don't know that term, statesman, it is simply someone prominent who is a leader, who's proven himself sometimes morally, sometimes through hard work, sometimes through, of course, spoils and financial influence, yes, but that is a statesman, a leader. Okay, so consider the title, Common Sense. Have you ever been told by your parents that you lack common sense? I certainly had been told that as a child, and I've perhaps told my children that too. Think about what that means. If it's common, it's something we're all supposed to have. Common sense, it's raining right now, to come in out of the rain. Common sense says to come in out of the rain. Common sense says if you're on fire, you stop, drop, and roll. Common sense. It's meant to be beyond simply self-preservation though, okay? It's supposed to be you doing things that are good for you. And we could say it's common sense not to smoke. Well, people still do it. It's common sense not to eat a dozen donuts for breakfast every day. Some people still do things like that. So sometimes common sense isn't common, is it? Profound, isn't it? All right. So, but what Paine is saying with a title like that is, hey, I'm about to drop some knowledge on you that you all should understand about your situation as a country. So his goal in writing Common Sense was to change colonists' attitudes towards independence and Great Britain. And think how powerful writing is. And guys, remember we just finished Frederick Douglass. And think about that. It's one thing for a political theorist who's maybe just sat in a comfortable chair his whole life to write about abolition, but it's another when Frederick Douglass does that sort of writing. And for Paine, who's lived in those times, who's lived in England as well, to say, guys, it's time to reject this, that's powerful. He's lived under that sort of regime. Okay. So, first of all, he says, colonists don't owe loyalty to King George III or any other monarch. That's a big statement because, again, remember, with the divine right of kings, that is the notion that if you reject the king, you're rejecting God. And that's something that people can feel quite fearful about. All right. So then there's this quote from Paine, in England a king hath little more to do than make war and give away jobs, which in plain terms is basically to impoverish the nation. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all crowned ruffians that ever lived. Ooh, no he didn't. Yes, he said it. All right, think about that. He's saying all a king does is make war. And I'm telling you guys, if you have any libertarian friends, this is what they say all government does. Make war and then give away jobs. And that's a spoils system. That's patronage. You are my friend, here is a job, a sinecure for you, which means a sinecure is a job for which you do nothing but you make money. So basically, to impoverish the nation, think about that. Where does the money come from to wage war? How do we pay soldiers? How do we pay for weaponry and their transportation and their training and their meals, salaries, everything? Okay, that doesn't come from the king's pockets or his personal treasury. No, that comes from the government. But where does the government get that money? taxes. So the people pay for wars. And the people, when that guy gets a job because he's the king's friend, but he doesn't really do anything, and hey, this can apply to presidents too. I'm an Ohioan. Think about President Harding, whether you've studied him or not. He's unfortunately infamous for giving jobs to his friends. But who pays their salaries? Again, we do through taxes, okay? So that's what a king does, he says, all right? And he says, you have to get rid of that notion that somehow, as a man, a king matters more, or as a woman, a queen matters more, somehow is more extra, more human, more knowledgeable, more wise, more moral, more powerful. No, 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 no. We are all the same. Okay, we are all the same by virtue of our humanity. And so he says, give me one honest man versus all the crowned ruffians and, scoundrels, ne'er-do-wells, cheats, liars. We've studied some of these English kings, and we know that they weren't always moral, right? Sometimes they chased the ladies and did too much drinking and all of that stuff. We've talked about this. Lasciviousness, right? So, okay. Next, he's saying the colonists owe nothing to Britain. Okay, so consider that. Consider that. If the colonists are looking at this like the loyalists perhaps are saying, but that's our mother country. They created us. They birthed us. Okay, think of it, mother country and then the colony. What Paine wants the Americans to understand is everything the British did was not for your good, but for their self-interest. Okay, the British did things for you so that you would make money that they could come and then take away from you in the form of taxes. Not to mention that we've talked about the whole purpose of imperialism, and you're going to study the age of imperialism whenever y'all study World War I. But having an empire, not only are you as the main country using those natural resources for your wealth, but you're using the people as cheap labor. And then you have people that you are going to make fight for you when you get into wars. And it's a sign of your power and your strength to have an empire. So this isn't about your good. It's not like your parents and you, where they care about you and they want you to be happy in life and to be able to take care of yourselves. And they anxiously look out for you. It would be as if your parents were planning for you to become a doctor so that one day you could pay all their bills. Which probably you don't have that kind of relationship with your parents, but Britain gets something out of this. This is not for your good, Paine is saying. And so this book was successful. It sold 500,000 copies in 6 months. That's a bestseller, all right? And many of the members of the Continental Congress read the book, and they were convinced of the need for independence as well. So remember, initially, after Lexington and Concord, they drafted the Olive Branch Petition, which is to say, King George, just take away the intolerable acts, and this all goes away. We'll remain loyal to you. It's past that. It's the point of no return now, okay? So consider this. How did the ideas and common sense become government policy? How does that eventually lead to the Declaration of Independence? Realize that this isn't, again, some guys in taverns just saying, I like it, let's do it. That's not how government works. Well, maybe a little bit behind closed doors, but not entirely. So Representative Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution into the Second Continental Congress, June 7th, 1776. And it says, here's a quote, resolved that these U.S. colonies are, and of right ought to be, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and all political connection between them and Great Britain is and ought to be totally resolved. So we are saying to absolve something. We no longer owe allegiance to Britain. We are severing those ties. Imagine a rubber band between Britain and the colonies, and snip, done. We owe you nothing. and you can get out of our business now. Thank you very much. But they're not going down without a fight. The British aren't going to let them go that easily. Okay? And so, what were the delegates to do? They had to think about this. This was a resolution. They had to vote on it. Okay? So, here's the problem. If they declare independence, it's really the point of no return. Think about that. If you've tried very hard to be free, and the country that had kept you in bondage, that had made you subservient to it, didn't want you to be free, and then you lose a war, things are going to be far worse in the future. Remember how the British, after the Boston Tea Party, how they passed the Quebec Acts, limiting the freedoms of Canadians very much in the hopes that a Sons of Liberty wouldn't spring up there and the Canadians wouldn't try to get the same sort of freedom, okay? So this means it's going to be far worse. So this is a risk. They are taking a risk here, okay? If they lose as well, these delegates in this government, they will be hung as traitors because this is treason to break away from your government. So this is theoretical, yet it is also very personal. So after a debate, they appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration of independence. And who was on that committee? John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, a few others. And the actual purpose of drafting a formal declaration of independence is to announce to the world why the colonies were breaking free of Great Britain. Now you may wonder, why was Jefferson chosen to write this? And this is where I think learning about history is interesting. We have these notions that, Jefferson's just out one day and decides to write the Declaration, then takes it and shows it to people. They say, we like it. No. There was more process behind it. He was chosen. So he was chosen because he had a reputation as a clear and graceful writer. So think about that. To write with clarity and grace. That is what great writing is. Are you able to get your point across succinctly? This is not the time for flowery language, right? Are you able to do so in a manner that shows a country that has learning, that has grace, that has some elegant language? This is why Jefferson was chosen. So, all right. Here's how that process went. In late June, the declaration was completed and read to Congress. By July 2nd, the Continental Congress voted that the 13 colonies were free and independent states. And then on July 4th, they adopted the Declaration of Independence. And it was ordered to be printed and distributed. So understand right away that they are making a government that is transparent to the people. They want the people to know what they are up to, and not only do they want them to know what they're doing, they want them to write these words on their hearts and their souls, because this is what it means to be an American. And this is how they're changing from being British subjects into fighting for something greater. All right. And of course, the story we know, John Hancock, he was the president of the Continental Congress. He signed first, and we've heard the story. He signed in such a large hand so George could read it without his glasses. And so how did the people of America react to the publishing of the Declaration of Independence? Strongly. In New York, the colonists tore down a statue of King George III. And that's incredibly symbolic. Anytime there's a revolution, you will find walls are torn down, statues removed. In my lifetime, I think statues of Lenin were pulled down, and Stalin in Red Square in Moscow, to say this is no longer the Soviet Union. That is a you can judge a culture by what they make statues to, what is important to them, and then you can judge how that culture changes by when they tear those statues down. In Boston, the cannons were fired through celebration. And then I have something I want to share with you quickly before we say goodbye for today. Let's see, this is page 54. Okay, so here's a bit more to the story about the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so John Adams, he stood up in the middle of a meeting of the Second Continental Congress. He was not a tall man like Washington, this we know. He did not have Washington's commanding ways. He was brilliant, and he was a great speaker, however. He had been the lawyer defending the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, and even though most of his neighbors thought the Redcoats had done wrong, Adams had convinced the jury that the soldiers had been attacked by a mob throwing rocks, snowballs, and chunks of ice. And we know oyster shells, right guys? Greatly outnumbered, Adams argued the Redcoats probably had no way to defend themselves, but with their muskets, and he won the case. And we know more of those details, of course, about who yelled in the alley. Fire, darn you, fire. Okay. Now he stood in front of the Continental Congress and used all his wisdom for the cause of independence. As the storm battering Caesar Rodney shoved its dark clouds into Philadelphia, Adams reminded his neighbors of the king's abuses. He told them that the patriot militiamen had passed the trial of fire in the French and Indian War. He said they would fight to defend their homes and families. Perhaps he said to the whole Congress what he had told his friend, Benjamin Rush, that they would win their freedom if they trusted in God and confessed their sins. Someone suggested a trial vote to see where the delegates stood at present. Starting with New Hampshire, each colony's representatives gave their votes. When Georgia submitted the last vote, 9 colonies had voted for independence. Pennsylvania and South Carolina still held out. New York's delegates did not vote because they did not know the wishes of their assembly. Delaware could not vote because its 2 delegates disagreed. If only Rodney would come, their tie could be broken, so they're waiting on this one delegate. David, what are you doing? Okay. You want to say hello really quickly, David? You want to say hello?
Hi.
No one can see you. You want to say hello, Mary? Just say hello. My children are crawling under the table to get things. David, I can see your red hair. Say hello and go. I will be done in a moment and you can get what Dan needs, but say hello.
Hello.
Okay, now go.
Got it.
Okay, now go away, please. Bless your heart. Eat it. Okay, so they're waiting for one fellow. All right. So, let's see. Adams, Franklin, and the others talked to the delegates from Pennsylvania and South Carolina, desperately hoping to persuade them to change their votes. They hoped that every one of the colonies would vote for independence. It would take unity among them all to survive a war with England. Meanwhile, Rodney had traded his buggy for a horse during the night. Riding quickly through rough roads, he'd felt his legs whipped and slashed by unseen branches and briars. His horse had slipped and slid at one moment, through the deep mud in the next. Tired and sick, soaked to the skin, the patriot drove on. He had to arrive in time to vote for freedom. The sunrise was hidden by the storm clouds, but finally the sky grew light. So this guy's riding 80 miles to get to Philadelphia, by the way. On he galloped, so weary he could barely stay in the saddle. The morning passed and afternoon came. Had they already voted? Was his ride for nothing? Finally, the roofs of Philadelphia came into sight through the rain and mist. The speech made by Adams had convinced the delegates from South Carolina. They changed their vote to yes. The Pennsylvania delegates listened to Franklin and Paine. Dickinson and fellow Pennsylvanian Robert Morris were not in favor of voting yes, but they saw nearly all the other men disagreed. They decided to be absent for the final vote, so there would be unity. Ah, interesting. Now Delaware had to make up its mind. Hoofs clattered on the cobblestones in front of the State House. Thomas Paine looked out. Rodney had come! He hurried to meet him, and the two walked into the meeting room together. Rodney was worn out and splattered with mud. He took his seat, and the assembly got ready for a final vote. When Delaware was called for, Reed voted no, and McKeon voted yes. When his name was called, Caesar Rodney wearily rose to his feet. So this guy's going to be the tiebreaker. The tie was broken, and Delaware had made up her mind. Though it would be a week before New York's government would allow its delegates to cast a vote for independence, every man in the room knew that America would fight for freedom. It was July 2nd, 1776. 2 days later, on July 4th, the Continental Congress officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. It was to be America's official birthday. So, a little story from the times there. Well, students, I see our time has drawn to a close. Next time we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence and its structure as a document. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Toodaloo!